little bit.
All right, guys, I think we're going to get started. So welcome to those of you in the room and to those of you on Zoom. This is going to seem like overkill to you five, but I do have to read out all the COVID statements because we're having our very first in-person lecture this year. So first of all, before we begin the event today, we have to run through a few important housekeeping items. For those of you who are unaware, the bathrooms are down the hall. Due to COVID-19, we want to ensure we run through a few health guidelines with you. Please ensure you continue to wear your mask at all times unless you are actively consuming food or drink. Ensure you use hand sanitizer or wash your hands with soap and water frequently. There's hand sanitizer at the end of the room. If you need to cough or sneeze, please do so into your room or into your elbow or arm. If you start to feel unwell for any reason, no matter how minor the symptoms, please ensure that you keep your mask on. Immediately advise an event organizer, I guess that would be me, and then head home for the health and safety of those in attendance. In the event of an emergency, please stay calm. At this time, take a moment to find the closest emergency exit. The event staff will assist and direct you, but don't expect me to do that the rest of the time. Proceed to the exits as directed and continue to the muster point, which is Murray Fraser Hall. Please do not use the elevator. If you need assistance, please let a staff member know. And now I will move on to our territorial acknowledgement. So I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And now, without further ado, I would like to thank our first in-person speaker of the year for joining us today, Dr. James Chlup of the University of Manitoba. Dr. James Chlup is an associate professor of ancient history at the University of Manitoba and is currently the head of department and graduate chair, and has my deepest admiration for being able to do this right now. His research interests focus upon the literary evidence for the Middle and Late Roman Republic, especially Livy, Plutarch, and Frontinus. He's the co-editor of Greek and Roman military manuals, genre and history, and articles and chapters on Livy, Plutarch, Onasander, Caesar, and Frontinus. In addition to articles in preparation on Plutarch's life of Brutus and Frontinus, his major project is a commentary on Plutarch's life of Crassus, which is my favorite life of Plutarch's life. So thank you very much for being here with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. And before I begin, I'd just like to give a thank you to the people at the University of Calgary who made my visit possible. I think it was Reyes 18 months ago that first invited me here, and for Leslie, who's been doing the organizing since then. If you just check, the handout is both sort of back and sides. I apologize, I am a bit of a big handout user. The Stratagems of Sextus Iulius Frontinus lamentably rests in the shadow of his more appreciated and read treatise on aqueducts. In fact, one might not so humorously suppose that an even greater majority of scholars and students would be incognizant of Frontinus's military treatise if it were not for the fact that its author's two surviving works reside together in the same lobe volume. And while there is, you can see here, a good commentary available on aqueducts, there is, as far as I know, not been any substantial commentary on the Stratagems, any book of the Stratagems. While On Aqueducts unpretentiously offers itself as a utilitarian text on water management, Frontinus envisages the Stratagems as more than undistinctive vademecum. And this will be now number 1 on your handout. And I read this bit. For in this way, generals will be furnished with examples of advice and foresight, which will serve to foster their own ability for conceiving and executing like deeds. There will result the added advantage that he will not fear the issue of his own stratagem, if he will compare it with the experiments already successfully made. In the Latin, duces and concilium are textual signposts that this is a military text in the first instance. The latter evokes the practical advice for a specific situation that the general acquires from consulting his junior officers, which he presumably undertakes. Providentia, excogitandi, and comparabit, however, would seem to situate that advice within an engagement with the past to adjure action in the present, the Roman exemplary tradition, exemplis. Excogitandi surely insists that the reader will hazard more than a casual act of reflection. He does not expect a simple process of memorization and repetition. What follows is an effort to construct a framework to conceive how Frontinus participates in this cultural phenomenon. Lurking within the exposition of this inquiry is an ulterior motive: to advocate for the Stratagems as a serious intellectual text with nuances in its exploration of warfare, not a hodgepodge assemblage of military anecdotes as it may initially appear to be. The usual caveat will, of course, apply here. Answers may not be immediately forthcoming, but perhaps there will be a better understanding of the problem. This is a fortuitous time to begin to undertake this task, a stratagem of opportunity. The last 2 decades has witnessed a deeper awareness of the multivalent character of Roman exempla. In addition to studies that focus on specific authors, for example, Jane Chaplin on Livy, Ben Tipping on Silius Italicus, the subject has profited immensely from 2 broader studies by Matthew Roller and Rebecca Langlands, which expose the nuances of the production and reinterpretation of Roman exempla. And I cannot recommend highly enough Langland's study. It's big, it's dense, but it's definitely worth the effort. And Michael Uliot's very recently published study provides invaluable comparative insight from the early modern period, a colleague from the Department of English. I've only just received his book, so I've not finished it yet. However, neither Roller nor Langlands includes Frontinus in their discussions, focusing on more mainstream authors such as, obviously, Cicero, Valerius Maximus, Seneca the Younger, and Livy. It is important to note that in writing the Stratagems, Frontinus charts a different course from the extant previous examples of the military manual in 2 ways. First, most of his predecessors composed theoretical texts discussing warfare without reference to specific leaders or battles. A minor exception here is Aeneas the Tacitician's How to Survive Under Siege, which includes historical examples in support of the author's recommended tactic in a few instances, but these are more a garnish than a substantial repast. And I list here 2 lost ones. This is Cato and Pyrrhus with an asterisk because I'll be coming back to them a little bit later. Frontinus himself wrote a now lost treatise that appears to be theoretical in scope. If he composed this text before the Stratagems, it might reflect his realization that a theoretical text in and of itself could not provide adequate guidance. If he composed it later, then it may indicate that actual practice can inform theory. And whereas previous authors restrict their focus to one aspect of warfare, siege warfare, cavalry fighting, war engines, leadership, in a brief treatise, normally the length of 1 book of a prose text, the Stratagems ambitiously features the near totality of war in approximately 600 stratagems across 4 books. We have Matters Before Battle, Book 1, Battle Itself, Book 2, Conducting a Siege and Defending Oneself Against the Same, Book 3, and broader topics, Book 4. Book 4 is going to be especially important to me. To be sure, there are advantages to both a focused and a broader text. The former is an easier to access work if the reader general only wants to learn about a specific kind of battle for a specific situation, perhaps while on campaign, but hopefully not while actual fighting is in progress. The latter is for the reader who wants a totalizing view of warfare across time, space, and culture in a more leisurely and reflective academic study. Valerius Maximus's memorable deeds and sayings, composed during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, is the most temporally proximate surviving exemplarist text to the Stratagems. Thus, it can serve as a useful initial point of comparison to determine whether Frontinus intends to work within the exemplary tradition or he seeks to chart an alternate path. Valerius offers an encyclopedic catalogue of exempla arranged by moral themes, presenting Roman, then non-Roman examples, almost always with a brief introduction and sometimes with a transition passage between the subsections. Frontinus follows this Roman, not Roman structure only twice, and he abstains from authorial framing. In his discussion of unexpected attacks, chapter 9, book 3, he provides 4 Roman stratagems, followed by 6 non-Roman ones, and discussing the effect of discipline, chapter 2 of book 4, he provides 3 Roman examples and 6 non-Roman. One inclines to consider these a casual nod to Valerius, though Valerius tends to provide far more Roman than non-Roman exempla. Frontinus's decision to eschew a Roman, non-Roman structure is due to his overall approach to exempla, whereby, as I shall attempt to demonstrate in a moment, Roman stratagems contextualize non-Roman ones and vice versa. Valerius's more rigid structure only allows for the Roman to frame the foreign, which is a barrier to the production of a transnational message, a restrictive effect on exempla, with the non-Roman functioning as an appendix to the normally positive Roman message. Though it may allow for a transhistorical message, depending on the temporal spread within each subsection. Frontinus clearly desires both. In his 4th book, Frontinus shifts to broader themes that do not pertain directly to battle tactics only. Note his recognition, this will be number 2 on your handout, that these fall, I quote, less naturally under the former classification, more military science than stratagems. This is where Frontinus's engagement with Valerius is most likely to occur, not in the more mundane provision of specific tactics one ought to employ in different stages of battle. Frontinus initiates the book with a chapter on discipline, a critical moral subject to be sure, but one also pertinent to the waging of a military campaign. This expansive chapter, 46 stratagems, the second longest of the treatise, allows Frontinus to reconnoiter the thematic overlap between the moral and the practical applications of discipline. Valerius himself includes a not insignificant chapter on military discipline in chapter 7, book 2 of his work, overwhelmingly Roman, 21 Roman, 2 non-Roman, which he prefaces by noting discipline's role in the Roman Empire's creation. I give this to you as 3a on the handout. Valerius writes something similar as in an interjection a third the way through the chapter. Most interesting is the concurrence in the exempla between the 2 authors. 9 of Valerius's exempla replay in Frontinus's chapter, with the first 2, Scipio Aemilianus and Quintus Metellus, occurring in the first and second position respectively in both, and all but one exemplum, Scipio Africanus, that's why I put the hashtag by his name here, perform the same exemplary action in both texts. So Scipio does one thing, Africanus does one thing in Frontinus, but it's something else in Valerius. Frontinus uses half of Valerius's chapter, but then supplements it with over 30 additional examples. However, Valerius is quite parsimonious with his non-Roman examples, including only 2, as I mentioned above. Frontinus disperses 6 non-Roman examples throughout the chapter, nudging incrementally, admittedly only, away from Valerius's pro-Roman message. To be sure, a chapter on discipline is the obvious, that is, easiest place for Frontinus to create a link to Valerius. Or, to look at it another way, not linking to this chapter might perplex. It reveals that Frontinus desires to indicate familiarity with Valerius's work and work with or build upon his predecessor instead of against him, and through or alongside Valerius to link the stratagems to the exemplary tradition. The amount of overlap may suggest that both authors are drawing upon a communis opinio on Roman exempla with respect to this particular topic. Frontinus's more expansive chapter reflects the needs of his own text, military discipline obviously being a topic of greater significance in a military manual than a generalized exemplum collection. Both authors diverge in their respective subsequent chapter. Valerius turns to a triumph, the celebration of military victory. Valerius puts the cart before the horse. I apologize for the Shakespeare reference. Frontinus's focus is more immediate, proving how discipline can facilitate victory. Here he fills the albeit narrow gap in Valerius's argument. The brevity of Frontinus's treatment on the effect of discipline quantifies the efficacy of corrective prescriptions catalogued in the chapter preceding. Several of the stratagems entail statistics to indicate that a disciplined army can defeat one much larger. The superlative example that lies at the heart of this chapter features Alexander orbem terrarum vicit, due to the discipline instilled in the Macedonian army by Philip. This underscores quite powerfully with the subtext that the effort of one can benefit another. The familial connection alludes to the role that a father ought to play in shaping his offspring's moral compass. And therefore, this stratagem could be an implied recognition on the intergenerational perpetuation of exempla, a theme that recurs in Valerius's text and other authors. A second instance of overlap between Frontinus and Valerius is their discussion of justice. And this is, let's go back quickly, is chapter 4 in book 4. Occurs in chapter 5, book 6 in Valerius. It is quite a conspicuous chapter in the stratagems in that it consists of only 2 examples and is therefore the shortest chapter in the treatise, and both are Roman. In his introduction to his chapter, Valerius provides a succinct allocution of the Romans' moral superiority. This is item 3b on your handout. Frontinus might consider Valerius's statement on Romans as the ultimate exemplars too broad, where Valerius provides 4 non-Roman examples in addition to his 10 Roman ones. Frontinus's omission of any non-Romans practicing justice in battle implies that the Romans are the only exemplars, embracing the Roman chauvinism that he otherwise avoids and Valeriously enthusiastically champions. Frontinus's 2 examples of justice in warfare are Marcus Furius Camillus and Gaius Fabricius Licinius. These are the first and fourth examples in Valerius's chapter. The alignment is stronger if one exudes Valerius's 6 Roman examples that pertain to domestic politics. As is typical, Valerius provides more detail. For example, he names the doctor who makes the offer to Fabricius to poison Pyrrhus. Both authors underline the Romans' moral rectitude. Note in the Camillus example the strong similarities between the second half of Frontinus's final sentence and Valerius's final sentence. Justice leads to victory through the filter of Camillus's primary moral credential, beneficium. And where both authors ascribe Roman victory to Camillus's kindness, Frontinus articulates more clearly Camillus's virtue by explicitly stating the immoral aspect that Camillus disavows, fraude. Both authors situate Fabricius as reacting to the doctor's overture. In neither author does Fabricius serve as the subject of the opening clause, though Frontinus does afford Fabricius primacy through his appearing first. This arguably directs focus on his reaction to and then rejection of the doctor's offer. Moreover, in Valerius, Camillus and Fabricius act after consultation with the Senate, and note the Senate's thoughts in the Fabricius passage. In Frontinus, the decision on how to proceed is exclusively the general's. Thus, in Valerius, generals represent a collective Roman moral compass, remaining consistent with the collective identity that his preface suggests. Frontinus's commanders decide individually, implying that each Roman should know how to act in a similar situation, independent of external guidance or motivation, and may need to make double quick such a decision. Whereas Valerius affords the Romans a position of textual advantage through his structure, the numerical superiority of their examples, and forthright contextualization, Frontinus places the non-Roman on a more even footing. In fact, the first three books feature the Romans in the minority, although the Romans dominate book 4. The star of the stratagems, if one indeed can use such a term, is non-Roman, Hannibal, who appears in no fewer than 45 stratagems, normally as a sagacious strategist, but also one who occasionally falls prey to a stratagem ventured by his Roman challenger. As a point of comparison, here's where I get to do my funky graphics. Marius, Sulla, and Pyrrhus each appear 11 times. Epaminondas, Cato, and Mithridates appear 12. Scipio Africanus, 15. Pompey, 16. Alexander, 17. And Caesar, appropriately, is the most prominent Roman at 28 appearances, still a distant second to Hannibal. On one level, Hannibal's prominence speaks to the unceasing high regard that the Romans had for Hannibal's strategic faculties 3 decades after the fact. And it's always useful to remember that Frontinus is writing probably around the same time as Pliny the Elder. And Pliny the Elder made the point that in his time, there were actually still 3 statues of Hannibal available in the city of Rome. So that is indicative of the regard they had for him. Scholars, and here I unabashedly include myself, have highlighted a particularly sophisticated aspect of Frontinus's text, to which I alluded earlier. His deft arrangement of exempla within sections to record additional meaning to each. That is, while at the zero-sum level, a stratagem exists on its own, the stratagems that Frontinus situates before and after, often immediately, but sometimes slightly farther away in the chapter, affects partially the reader's encounter with it. In his chapter on choosing the location for battle, this is now number 5 on your handout, Frontinus naturally includes Hannibal's judicious selection of his position in relation to the river at Cannae, which in the text appears immediately after Hannibal defeats Marcellus at Numistro. Frontinus connects the passages by beginning the second one, idem apud Cannas, which highlights that Hannibal uses the same tactics successfully and repeatedly against the Romans. Frontinus deploys a textual ambush through temporal inversion. Numistro on its own simply reads as Hannibal's victory, but when the reader next encounters Cannae, he cannot but realize that the 6-year span between the battle underlies that the Romans did not promptly learn how to counteract their enemy. Furthermore, Frontinus marches Hannibal towards greater victory. He achieves Vicit Clarissimum Ducum at Numistro and Ilam Memorabiliam Victoriam at Cannae. Hannibal defeats a Roman general in the first battle, or the second battle, and in the second battle, or the first battle, he achieves an implied victory over Rome herself. Here, Numistro amplifies Hannibal's victory at Cannae. While the exempla within a specific section build a cumulative case for a course of action or a moral theme, it can also problematize that tactic or topic. Frontinus can both advance the credentials of a general and undermine him. In another reference to cani, in the section on the placement of troops, this will be number 6 on your handout, Hannibal's men give way in the center, drawing the Romans forward, whom Hannibal's army then envelops. That famous maneuver. However, the next stratagem features the Romans performing the same tactic against Hasdrubal at the Metaurus River. Then, Hannibal, having experienced defeat not once, but frequentibus pro elliis at Marcellus's hands, uses terrain and posting of troops in a way to withdraw easily into his camp, should he lose to the Romans yet again. The second and third stratagems dilute Hannibal's victory in the first, which Frontinus deliberately places side by side by side, to create this impression instead of spreading them across the chapter of 24 stratagems. In historical terms, the second battle, Metaurus River, undoes the first, marking the beginning of the end for Hannibal in Italy. This, as my chapter in my book demonstrates, is mostly how Frontinus deals with Hannibal and cani. The stratagem itself acknowledges Hannibal's victory, but its broader relationship with surrounding passages undermines that victory and mitigates the Romans' defeat. Frontinus charts an alternate ideological course from Valerius vis-a-vis war by including examples from the Roman Civil War in the final century BCE. In fact, Valerius declares his intention to avoid these examples in one very prescient moment. To Frontinus, internecine conflict is simply another theater to understand war. A stratagem is a stratagem is a stratagem. The shifting back and forth between Romans fighting Romans and Romans fighting others reflects better the reality of Roman military history. There is one instance where the deft intermixing of wars foreign and domestic quite effectively highlights their symbiotic nature. And this is an extended cluster of no fewer than 11 stratagems in the chapter on ambushes and treachery, which centers around Gnaeus Pompey, the very man who triggers Valerius to indicate he will not write about civil war. One noticeable aspect of the first two stratagems is that they are much longer by a significant degree than Frontinus's usual few sentences for each stratagem. This may be the author's unvocalized declaration that learning from civil war is necessary. The first stratagem entails Mithridates plotting Lucullus's assassination. That the plot fails, this exacerbates Mithridates' losing to Lucullus. Virtute frequenter superatus, as Frontinus writes. This establishes a high bar for Pompey to impress. However, the next stratagem features Sertorius effecting not one, but two victories against the so-called Magnus. The first is an ambush of Pompey's men returning with provisions during the night. The second is a defeat of the reinforcements that Pompey sends forth while he looks on. A double stratagem in a single section is unprecedented in the treatise. In the next stratagem, Pompey ambushes Sertorius' successor Perpenna's army. Here, Frontinus shifts back to his typical brevitas, which conveys the alacrity with which Pompey grabs victory from the jaws of defeat. Frontinus then lurches east, where Pompey employs a night ambush against Mithridates. The nocturnal maneuver surely recalls Sertorius' night assault. Placing these stratagems almost side by side collapses the temporal distance of the events and reiterates Pompey as an erudite student of strategy. The next stratagem features Marcus Licinius Crassus employing an ambush in the Spartacan War. In temporal terms, it links Pompey's successes in Spain and against Mithridates from west to east via Italy, where Pompey's opportune arrival in Italy allowed him to claim partial credit in the Servile War, and the victories in Spain and then Italy positions him for taking up the command against Mithridates. 3 stratagems that feature Gaius Cassius Longinus and Publius Ventidius against the Parthians create the false impression, a textual ambush, that Frontinus has moved on from Pompey. However, the temporal proximity to Pompey means that the reader's historical train of thought does not wander too far, and if it does, the route back is shorter. The next stratagem entails Caesar defeating Pompey's affiliate Afranius in Spain. Frontinus does not identify Afranius's connection to Pompey, but the fact that his proxy loses in the same theater as Pompey emerged as a skilled general is surely an historical irony not lost on the reader. The final stratagems, Antony ambushing Pansa and Curio's defeat at Juba's hands, reminds the reader that even Caesar and his successors do not experience unceasing victory. But Frontinus does not conclude or even include elsewhere Caesar versus Pompey at Pharsalus, leaves the outcome of this phase of civil war unresolved in the text, and Pompey's victory is not wholly eclipsed. These examples indicate, I hope, the wide historical and cultural scope of the stratagems, which means that Frontinus undoubtedly read very widely to mine historical and biographical text for his examples, and reflected upon the different representations of historical figures and their stratagems across texts. Frontinus's status as a member of the educated political elite, of course, meant that he did some, if not most, of his reading as part of his lifelong study. And the pervasiveness of Roman exemplary culture would mean that he would be intimately familiar with the most famous exempla. Frontinus's reader was likewise historically knowledgeable. In his preface, this would be number 7 in your handout, Frontinus forestalls protestations that what he offers in the stratagems is available elsewhere. The phrase "in some fashion, aliquo modo" is important to me. Frontinus petitions for recognition that while he describes historians' practice as another way to engage with exempla, he in fact advocates for his mode of exemplary engagement as a valid alternate path. While in one sense he's pointing out the obvious, the utilization of Roman exempla can occur in many cultural modes. It has no set genre. It may indicate Frontinus's expectations of initial resistance to the military manual as a venue to prospect exempla. Aliquo modo also draws the reader's attention to the junction of the various paths. While Frontinus here distinguishes the stratagems from historical narrative, he also deliberately draws attention to it, connecting his credibility to those authors despite their implied collective logorrhea. This is because Frontinus's stripped-down narrative cannot explore each exemplum fully. An historical narrative elaborates detail on context, on why someone does something exemplary or not, and how those who witness the event, the important internal audience, react, which shapes or sometimes challenges the reader's interpretation. Who are these historians who Frontinus has in mind here? Livy is clearly an important, if not the main, primary source for the Roman exempla. In fact, his name appears twice in the treatise, in both instances in close textual and temporal proximity. But these references may arise from an early editor's interference. Side note, I confess some observational bias here as someone who is peculiarly fond of Livy. And one notes how the editor of the Loeb edition throughout the footnotes promotes Livy as a Roman source. In using Livy in particular, Frontinus is not being original. Scholars recognize that Valerius also probably owes a literary debt to the historian. He too cites Livy. Both Frontinus and Valerius may have sought to simplify the research somewhat, and they could benefit from Livy's chronological expansiveness. And probably Valerius's work with Livy benefited Frontinus, working from Valerius. So I have a nice complicated diagram to try sort of explain this. So if we imagine our authors mapping them out here, we can think that Frontinus can work directly with exempla in their extra textuality. He can read Valerius, who's engaging with the exempla. He can read Livy and deliberately make the arrow a bit bigger, who's going to his sources, who's engaging with exempla, or goes to Valerius, who goes to Livy, and the process goes on there. It actually took quite a long time to get that diagram just right. If Livy is indeed a primary Roman source, and of course he too works from sources, then while Frontinus claims brevitas as a literary virtue, conveyed by his word velocitate, he does so in part because he can rest his terse prose upon Luius Ingens, as Marshall labels him. The exempla featuring Hannibal and Hasdrubal that I mentioned earlier betrays familiarity with Livy's mirroring of the Cannae and Metaurus narratives in the 3rd decade. And the Pompey cluster may reflect Frontinus writing with the 10th and 11th decades at hand. Thus, one can imagine multiple routes, some quite complex, by which exempla found their way into Frontinus's treatise. What about the non-Roman exempla? A cluster of Persian exempla in the chapter on the effect of discipline, this is the chapter 2, book 4, suggests that Frontinus has his copy of Xenophon's Anabasis at close hand. The last of these, the catabasis of Xenophon and his compatriots, encapsulate and hinges upon the substantial narrative unit of that text, almost everything from book 3 on. It is if not the, most extreme example of Frontinus as an historical abbreviator. In all of these instances, Frontinus presupposes that the reader will fill in the blanks and understand the intertextual relationships between passages in their original texts to validate the point that each stratagem aims to convey. Frontinus's restraint from editorializing, as Valerius does, and re-narrating Livy et alii on the one hand, and intermixing Roman and non-Roman exempla on the other, insists more forcefully on a contemplation of Roman exemplarity itself. The constant shift back and forth between Roman and non-Roman exempla across time and space forces the reader to reframe continuously his perspective, to consider repeatedly the possibility that the Roman way might not be the only way to be a good general, and by extension, a good person. That is, one reaches a conclusion after a thorough study that cuts across the axes of time, geography, and culture. Frontinus makes the consideration of exempla an inconvenient process, and encountering the structure repeatedly across the stratagems forces the reader to lean into this discomfiture. The shift towards a Roman-centered book 4 occurs only because Frontinus is confident that he has made a more universal understanding of exempla inescapable. To be sure, one can compare exempla across an historical text, even as one as expansive as Livy's, but one must work arguably much harder, reading more text, recollecting, and perhaps refamiliarizing oneself with something read quite some time ago. Reading 2 exempla from different parts of the text side by side seems unlikely. Frontinus perhaps repays his debt to Livy by facilitating in the stratagems what is mirabile factu within the ab orbe condita. The stratagems points to some instances where one might endeavor a comparison across time. In other words, Frontinus provides an outline to reread Livy in a different way, which in turn creates fresh avenues to read exemplarity. In other words, the alternate mode, as Frontinus describes his text, becomes a tool by which one can read historical narrative aliquo modo. What Frontinus may give to history, Historical narrative also sheds light on a not immediately obvious and additional way to read or reread exempla in the stratagems. In a critical passage in his preface, I give this to you as number 8 in the handout, Livy explains the benefit of historical study. The historian's confirmation that there are exempla that one studies to avoid duplicating the mistakes made by the person or persons involved points to the other function of exempla. Livy provides several excellent negative examples. For instance, the narrative of Manlius Capitolinus in Book 6, and Valerius thoroughly explores negative characteristics in his focused 9th book. In the case of the stratagems, one might very well conceive that Frontinus overlays these two types of exempla. That is, while in the Ab Urbe Condita and the Memorable Deeds and Sayings, one reads an exemplum either in terms of emulating a virtuous action or avoiding repeating an error. In Frontinus, one explores a stratagem to learn how to achieve victory and how to hypothesize how to avoid defeat. However, since Frontinus does not frame his exempla, this requires that the reader decide the path to work with or against the primary mode of the example, or, if both ways, in which order. And in the case of the latter, one must perform some mental strategizing to imagine an opportune countermeasure. Simply put, this entails the reader conceptualizing a counter-exemplar. Admittedly, Frontinus in his preface, in the passage I mentioned at the very start of my paper, seems to advocate for learning how to win, but he does not preclude avoiding defeat. To mention defeat in any context might seem counterintuitive, an ill-advised peremptory own goal. He needs to begin the treatise by accentuating the positive of military victory. One might imagine that ex cogitandi, I'm working this word quite hard, isn't it? Creates at least some discursive space for this thought exercise to occur. Perhaps Frontinus believes that working through the text, the reader will acquire cumulative knowledge and diagnostic confidence that provides the skills to engage with the treatise in this way. Most critically, this scenario creates another situation whereby Frontinus's reader plays a more active role in the evaluation of exempla, reframing it to expand his military knowledge, learning offense and defense in almost every instance. This possible dualistic reading exempla builds upon, and in fact gathers some impetus from, Frontinus's framing an exemplum through its textual neighbors. Hannibalic victory, diluted through its intratextual relationships, could very well direct the reader to reread and reimagine the exemplum itself from the perspective of the Romans. In other words, the Romans could, in theory, when it cannot, if only. While Frontinus lays claim to historical expertise in his judicious selection of examples, as can any author using exempla, he also situates the stratagems in the tradition of military expertise by including prominent generals known for their authorships of military treatises in their time and alluding to their status as general authors. Two such agents are, of course, Cato the Elder and Pyrrhus. Cato carries the additional credential of being an historian who deploys heavily exempla in his historical origines. Xenophon, I should just mention, also appears in the stratagems, but these references pertain to his status only as a general. There are no references to the cavalry commander, on horsemanship, or the chiropaidia. And while the first of these is a military manual, stricto sensu, the chiropaidia has clear overlapping interests with the genre. It is quite tempting to suppose that Frontinus teases Cato as a military author in the very first exemplum that appears in the text. Book 1, Chapter 1, Stratagem 1. This is 9a on your handout. His act of writing, scripsit, affects the surrender of multiple cities without bloodshed, creating the ironic situation where the first stratagem does not feature actual military combat. That every state believes, credit it. What they read is a metatextual authentication of the potency of Cato's prose, that the stylus is at least equal to the gladius, conjoining writing and military action. There's a potential, or better, potential reference to Cato's writing in the expansive chapter on discipline that I mentioned earlier, where he reveals his famous harshness by imposing the punishment of cutting off the right hand of soldiers caught stealing. This is 9b on the handout. This stratagem launches with the bold textual marker, Marco Cato Memoriae Tradidit. The verb occurs in a reference to Cato and wine in the chapter on moderation, chapter 3 of book 4, Traditor, a nod to Cato's austerity as a modus vivendi. Tradidit in the first passage could refer to Cato's writings, the Origines, his De Re Militari, or both. The repetition of the verb in textual proximity in specific connection to Cato blurs the line between, or possibly joins, Cato as a military author and as an historical exemplum, both within his own writing, as a historian and a military author, and writing about him. And this situates Cato as a complex exemplar, whereby his status as author general cannot exist distinct from his status as a moral exemplum and vice versa. The situation is more straightforward with Pyrrhus. Frontinus refers to Pyrrhus's treatise in the second of two side-by-side stratagems. I'm giving this to you as number 10 on the handout. The phrase inter praecepta imperatoria memoriae tradidit is important. Memoriae tradidit here pre-frames the phrase's meaning when it recurs with reference to Cato in book 4. Praecepta certainly refers to military writing. It's one of the words we've often used as a title for military manuals, in Latin at least. The textual adjacency of these two Pyrrhus stratagems teases that both probably originate in Pyrrhus's work. Idem in the second stratagem connects them, though one suspects that they appeared in the reverse order. The second stratagem, if one can call it that, since it is advice rather than a tactical proof, devoid as it is of historical specifics, relies on the first to prove that Pyrrhus's tactic works. Theory reinforcing practice instead of vice versa may be a deliberate inversion to draw attention to how one acquires expertise, a metatextual prompt on how to read the stratagems. Reading specifics labeled experimentes in the preface in the first instance to visualize a broader theoretical outline. If so, then what Frontinus hints here is that his treatise is not a radical departure in the genre from theoretical texts that came before. It is a text that provides a foundation for a new theory, capital N, capital T, of military practice, starting the thinking process anew. Finally, it is curious that Frontinus almost admits reference to his own first-hand military expertise. Such modesty was very unlikely from Cato or Pyrrhus in their texts. This is now number 11 on your handout. In his only act of self-reference, Frontinus describes his kind treatment of the Legones, who suffer neither pillage nor other harm, a result of which is their surrender. The city as an opulentissima civitas affirms Frontinus's superlative skills as dax in restraining his soldiers from plunder. Moreover, Frontinus anticipates Camillus's beneficium. Granted, Frontinus does not use the word with reference to himself. He's too unpresuming, which places himself as a continuator of an exemplary figure in historical time, but the model that Camillus retroactively authenticates in textual time. The grammar reveals the author to be in a particularly self-deprecating move, making himself almost an afterthought, mihi, at the very end of the passage. The textual distance that Frontinus creates between Domitian and himself, Domitian's name appearing at the start of the exemplum, perhaps indicates tension between the real and imagined expert, between he who undertook the military action and he who took credit for it. Military expertise is a complicating ingredient in exemplary engagement in the stratagems, arguably a unique factor within the Roman literary exempla tradition. Does the expertise of authors such as Pyrrhus and Cato supplement exempla, or does it distract even more momentarily from it? Frontinus first needs to decide upon which Cato and Pyrrhus he wants, their representations as historical and biographical narratives, their status and self-presentation as military experts to their own writings, or a balance between the two. And in the case of Pyrrhus, there is the awkward reality that he did not always successfully execute what he may have advocated. There's at least one example, unless his treatise incorporated what he learned from his Italian campaign. It may be that Frontinus relies on their names carrying elusive weight, prompting the reader to recall the treatises that each wrote, and serving as confirmation by Frontinus of his awareness of the generic tradition in which he works. However, an over-reliance on general authors might inadvertently create a hierarchy of the text, whereby the reader privileges experts and subconsciously undervalues amateur, yet equally, if not more, talented generals, and the actions that they execute. And too large a presence of these expert authors in their texts may divert the reader to those very texts at the expense of Frontinus's. Most critically for exemplary engagement, it might also dissuade the armchair enthusiast from thinking about Frontinus's text in its broader moral frame. The chapter on justice, for instance, might lose its ethical potency if expertise narrowly focuses the mind on winning, without due consideration of the path one ought to take to get there. It is surely, therefore, not remiss to conclude that Frontinus's engagement with the exemplary tradition is not incidental, but multifaceted. On the one hand, he works within the established tradition by featuring the same cast of exemplary Romans and others doing things worthy of emulation. Therefore, the Stratagems is a link in a chain, engaging with predecessors in the tradition such as Livy and Valerius Maximus, and serving as a point of reference for later authors. While Frontinus expands the scope of the tradition by providing an additional discursive platform in the form of a military manual, his genre enables him to underline or redirect attention back to a distinctive criterion, military leadership and service, which one should use to guide one's actions. It is a narrow rubric, to be sure, but in so doing, Frontinus contributes to a debate about the nature of exemplarity, seeking to shape how present and future readers engage with the past and their identity, and this should allow one to recognize the Stratagems as a text of cultural significance, rather than to regard it as an intellectual curiosity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, you're okay. We'll open it to questions. And for those of you on Zoom, if you would like to put your questions in chat and I can read them out. You want to start? I'm just watching the chat here. All right, well, I'm going to start because I have been, I've been actually working with a history honors student this term on military manuals in the Byzantine period, which is my period.
Okay.
And I am quite fascinated by what you've been talking about because we've been puzzling out the differences between the Strategicon and then later on Leo VI, very odd manual. And this might be a slightly unfair question, but I'm wondering if you have any sense of how this may have influenced some of the later ones, like the Strategicon, or even later than that.
The only author where we could say there definitely does appear to be an influence is Polyaenus.
Oh, okay.
And so he then is writing very early in the joint reigns of Varus and Marcus Aurelius. And he writes, his work is actually 8 books of stratagems. Incredibly frustrating in that it has so few sort of Roman ones, and surprisingly so few ones about Parthians in particular, because he actually says in his preface, I'm writing this to give you, Varus, advice as you're about to conduct this particular campaign.
Oh, wow, okay.
So it creates the illusion of breadth. It is very heavily inclined towards things Greek, including also some things mythological, and only has a tiny little bit about featuring Carthaginians and Romans. In fact, the Romans, I think, get the second half of book 8, so right at the end. So he's the only author where we know that we clearly think someone else has said, Frontinus' approach of doing it by this catalog sort of stratagems. Likewise, Polyaenus is quite pithy. So he sometimes just gives us a very sort of short one. Sometimes he gives us one that's a little bit longer, but he doesn't do overt or doesn't consistently do contextualizing like Valerius Maximus.
Okay, it's really interesting because there is a strange thing where we get this very odd military manual because it's the 9th century that harkens back to many of the things that are here.
Oh,
and
that's right, because Leo bases quite a bit of what he writes on Onasander.
Yes, I think that,
so.
yes, yeah. I've learned a lot working with him on this because this is not my.
Onasander is the person immediately prior to Frontinus. Onasander is writing during the reign of the Emperor Claudius. It also has no specific, it's a theoretical manual about how to be a general, no references to any specific campaigns and so forth. In fact, then has this very sort of perplexing beginning, talking about we're in this new era of holy peace. Why write a military manual if you think it's peace in our time?
Right.
It's sort of odd.
Yeah.
But I know I'm very interested in Onasander, having written an article about myself. I was very interested in the idea of the just war and so forth, which I think Leo then puts the Christian elements.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. And as I say, this is definitely not my area, but I've learned a lot working with Nick, and so I'm like, wait a minute. So great, thank you. Questions? Lisa.
Thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. I'm sorry, this is way out of my element, but I'm curious just from the perspective of the scholarship that's been done previously. Has Frontinus been overshadowed to what extent has Frontinus been overshadowed by Livy and Valerius?
So he's been greatly overshadowed by Livy. I sort of have to answer that in sort of various different ways.
Yeah.
First of all, I do think that military manuals probably have not received as much scholarly attention as they ought to have. And I came to this conclusion from being a Roman historian, where I tried doing a couple of iterations of a Roman army course. And the second and third time, I tried to bring military manuals into it and tried to give my students suggestions on scholarship, and there's surprisingly sort of very little. So the bibliography at the end of my handout, where you could expand it just a little bit, but not very much. In the case of Frontinus, I think it's because, and the surprising thing, everyone recognizes that he is someone who has military qualification. Tacitus tells us this in the Agricola. That's how good he was as a general.
Yeah.
You think if he wrote a manual, people would want to write about it. And it probably was read, in antiquity and through sort of the Middle Ages as an easy sort of go-to sort of manual. But everyone seems to be really drawn to the aqueducts. And I think this is just because it's practical. People are interested in how the water system works. And Frontinus, while he had a strong reputation as a military general, he had an even stronger reputation as a manager of the public works system.
Which makes sense.
Yes, but anyway. But yeah, so there's been a great deal of overshadowing that's changed a little bit over the last decade. So when it comes to the stratagems, there's my chapter, and I've got a few other things that I'm working on. Alice Koenig, someone else, has written a little bit about Onasander is also a little bit. Yes, there is a commentary that's sort of available. People generally, this is why the impetus for my edited volume sort of came up, was to provide this kind of sort of resource and push things a little bit along. And we're interested very much in the generic relationships. People sort of plunk it together, all military manuals, and call it technical literature, which then finds its way at some obscure shelf in the mind of classical literature. People aren't trying to put it much more towards being a historical text that people would read in addition to Livy and so forth.
And so,
Yeah.
sorry, follow up. It's just also that the fact that he's focusing on non-Roman in a very different way, right? So if you bring those non-Roman, those potential from non-Roman sources,
Mhm.
and how he's qualifying the non-Romans, is that different from some of our historians, right? I mean, is that another potential reason why he has been bookshelved, if you will, in terms of thinking about 19th century to early 20th century military thought?
That I don't know. I have to think about that. I would think if I were an actual sort of full-on military historian, it would bring greater weight to Frontinus. So, for example, we know Hannibal took an historian with him to sort of narrate the campaign sort of as he was going. I think Polybius actually quotes him. Livy does not. So Livy is very much so following Roman sources. But I wrote a very long chapter for my PhD on this. Livy is willing to give credit to Carthaginians and to Hannibal, sort of where it is due. But of course, he can do that because we all know what the end result is. Rome is going to win, Hannibal is going to lose, and he puts that little bit just before the Battle of Zama. What I was at Tresemi and Cannae, you, Scipio, are here. So that's sort of Livy's little safe space in that sense. But yeah, it may be a little bit of, as I said, Valerius clearly demonstrates what I like to call Roman chauvinism.
Yeah,
Frontinus does not.
yeah.
And maybe as authors read it, they thought, well, it's not Valerius. No. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just curious, kind of following up on that. This idea that he's not sort of employing that Roman chauvinism, as you say. Do you think there's an audience he's anticipating that's perhaps beyond the Roman? How would that play into it? If maybe he's writing, for a Greek general as well, or something else where he's expecting this to be more
The
universal.
only challenge to that is the fact that Frontinus has chosen to write in Latin.
Yeah.
And okay, we can assume that any skilled Greek general would know Latin as well as Greek. And that is probably the reason why Polyonius chose to write in Greek. It's not just for Verus, but to make it sort of to a wider audience. But we have to sort of acknowledge that there were readers out there who are not just Romans in Italy, who know Latin, who would have found it useful. And this could potentially then be their window, as it were, to other Latin historical texts like Livy. I won't say Sallust, because there's one reference, I think, to the Jugurthine War in Frontinus, and he does not mention Caroline at all. The histories maybe with Sallust. So it is possible that he's thinking of a wider, beyond the Roman audience. That to add to that, Frontinus is not hard Latin to read. Really good as an intermediate author if you're teaching sort of a Latin course. It's not Livy and it's not Tacitus. And I think that's sort of deliberate as well. And it's part of I want you to focus on the stratagem. I don't want you to focus too much on the grammar. Well, I think he does a few things with word order. I want to sort of distinguish there to make certain points. Yeah.
Interesting. Yes.
Stretch.
Mhm.
What are other possible non-Roman sources for similar stratagems, given that this is such a big empire?
This is the problem. It's because we just believe that we've lost
Yeah.
a huge amount of these texts. So if I'm looking at my list here, we desperately wish we had Pyrrhus's.
Mm.
I'm pretty sure that Cato's would have been almost obviously exclusive all about Rome, and actually probably fairly significantly about himself. Pyrrhus, though, we sort of get the impression it probably would have been a little bit sort of broader. And I should add, the thing that's fascinating about Pyrrhus is we know Romans still read it up until the time of Cicero. It's a letter of Cicero's. I always forget the exact reference. Somewhere, before he's writing to someone who's about to go off on a provincial governorship. It says, make sure that you take this version of Pyrrhus. It's actually an epitome of Pyrrhus's text.
Mhm.
It'll sort of be useful for you. So we know Romans were reading from this list. They would have read Xenophon, as we know. Actually, the one text, if you're a Roman general, you really want above everyone else is Xenophon's Chiropaidia. And we know that Scipio, that was the book he took with him. He actually took it with him on campaign, so reading from it.
Why? Why was that the one?
I would say it's because it gives you a bit of everything. It is a biography, which is a biography of a great man, capital G, capital M. It is partly a philosophical text about the nature of how one should rule, and how one should rule. It is part of a military manual, so it's a little bit of sort of everything. It's like, as I say, it's like you've gone to a buffet of literature and you decide you're going to have a starter from every single possible sections, or as it were. I think that's what it is that sort of tells us the generals wanted to learn how to win, like Cyrus. They also wanted to be good people. I mean, Onasander plunks right promptly. You want to be aner agathos as a general. That's philosophical. And yes, just sort of the broader, you want generals continue to learn while they campaign. Funny, I'm teaching my graduate Greek students Plutarch's Life of Brutus. And one of the criticisms of Brutus is, well, you should be preparing for the Battle of Philippi. He's reading his Plato and his Polybius. So we know this is what generals did when they thought they had spare time, or when they did have spare time. But yes.
That's interesting. It's such a weird text too.
It is.
Just generally, like I wouldn't have thought of that as the one, because there's so much going on in it. But
Yes.
yeah, that's fascinating. Any other questions to finish off today? Well, it just remains then for me to say thank you so very much. This was really interesting. And I suspect my student will be excited to see the recording of this. He couldn't come tonight, but this is really great. So thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you all.
And
Thank
we
you to everyone on Zoom.
yes, and thank you to all of you. Oh, there's some claps. We had 7 people on Zoom as well.
Okay.